got some FT breaking news. Legendary all-time MLB hit king Pete Rose passed away at the age of 83. Scotty Braun, Eric Kratz, and FT senior insider Ken Rosenthal with us right now. Ken, your thoughts here first on the initial reaction on Pete Rose passing away, and obviously he lived a very interesting life that went far beyond baseball. We've heard him in the news for many years since baseball, obviously for him not being allowed to be in the Hall of Fame and not be a part of baseball.
Obviously, my first reaction is surprise and sadness. I worked with Pete at Fox for a number of years, had a great relationship with him. I really enjoyed it. And there were times during my career where I interviewed him about his gambling, and some of those interviews were contentious about why he wasn't in the Hall of Fame. And at times he had a hard time understanding why the all-time hit leader, the guy who's played in more winning games than any player, was not in the Hall of Fame. But we all know why he wasn't in. And he tried for reinstatement. The commissioner, Rob Manfred, said he didn't make a significant reconfiguration in his life, and it just never happened. And that will go down as the saddest part of the Pete Rose story. He clearly is one of the greatest players in the game's history. No one would even dispute that, but because he bet on baseball, he was never getting into the Hall of Fame. That's the cardinal sin, and it's just a shame that it all kind of went down the way it did. And obviously, I'll miss him. He was such a character, and he was so much fun to work with at Fox. But that Hall of Fame thing, it just kind of hung over him always, and it was sad. It was sad the whole time.
No Hall of Fame will never take away 4,256 hits. That is a wild, wild number to have 4,256 hits. I'm not saying nobody will ever eclipse that, but I know this man was my dad's favorite player. My dad wore number 14 because of Pete Rose. He loved the way he played. And it's something that Hall of Fame, no Hall of Fame, gambling, no gambling, to get 4,256 hits in this game is incredible. And that's what he should be remembered for.
Eric, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought it up in that light because as a former player yourself, you can appreciate what that number means. That number, as you said, it's outrageous. And the way he played, it was all out every game. It was amazing. It was something to see. I remember him as a kid. I was at the game where he barreled into Bud Harrelson at Shea Stadium in the playoffs in 1973, and a big brawl ensued. He was just that kind of guy. And that is how he should be remembered. Of course, he's not going to be completely remembered for that because of the other thing, the gambling thing. But my goodness, what a player.
Ken, you watched him play. I never got to watch him play. I heard about it. Just the story you just told. In this game, if he just did not change a single thing that he did, I know he would still get the hits. The way he played, how would it be perceived? Would he be perceived as dirty, or as some of the kids say, a try hard? Because he played in more winning games. That is an actual stat. He played in more winning games. And how do you think he would be perceived as a player?
Nobody would play like that today. We all know this. The game is different. It's not as hard-edged as it was back then. Of course, there's the famous memory as well of Pete barreling into Ray Fosse in the All-Star game. I believe it was 1972, not sure. And that was the game back then. And he epitomized the game back then. Take no prisoners, play as hard as you can. And if it means taking out an opponent, you take out an opponent. The game, for better or worse, in some ways better in terms of injuries, and in some ways worse, it is different now. And I don't know, Eric, if I can even imagine him being perceived in today's game because that player would not exist. And you see that photo right there. That's a quintessential Pete Rose photo. Him diving headfirst into a base. That was him.
And he was a favorite player of so many baseball fans that spanned really decades, generations, whatever you want to call it. Do you think, Ken, that, and by the way, I don't want to let this go for the kids. His nickname was Charlie Hustle. So the hustle was even in the nickname. But back to the controversy for a moment, because I do think when you reflect on a player, and I think this is part of it, you want the accolades to be remembered. But so much of his story since he played has been a rallying cry from many fans around baseball saying he should be in the Hall of Fame. And I think there are two components here. Should he be coaching or working in a front office or any of that since he had played when he was banned for baseball? No, and even when they're applying for reinstatement. But do you feel like there was a separation from that versus being allowed into the Hall of Fame where it's not like you're doing any harm to the current sport at the time? And do you think that there's a chance he ever ends up getting voted in or, whatever you call it? What's the word that I
Well,
can't pronounce?
posthumously.
Yes.
He's not getting voted in. And remember, the baseball writers did not have the chance to vote him in after he was banned. There was no opportunity. And he's not getting in through any veterans committee. If he was reinstated, I guess it would be possible. I actually don't know the mechanics off the top of my head on how that would work. But under this commissioner, who has repeatedly denied his request for reinstatement, and understandably so, I don't know that he's ever getting in. But to answer your question, Scott, in my view, there should be separation. It's not the hall of good people. We know that. We know of many miscreants that are in Cooperstown, enshrined there, and immortalized forever. We know of players who use steroids who are now in the Hall of Fame. What Pete did, again, was violate the cardinal rule, the one rule that is in every clubhouse. You can't touch it. He knew it, and he did it as a player and manager. That's really bad. But that's part of his story. And that is part of how he should be remembered in the Hall of Fame. I have no problem with a guy like that in the Hall of Fame if it says on his plaque, hey, this is why he ended up in the situation he did. It's similar to players who maybe were using steroids. Now, I don't vote for certain players who use steroids because the guys who did it after the rules were in place and they were knowingly violating the rules, to me, you blew it. But I even get the argument for those guys. So it is a difficult question. I don't know that he'll ever get in. And my goodness, if he was going to get in, it should have been while he was alive.
Yeah, I agree. That's always when you want to do this and figure this out. And if they hadn't figured it out for this long, then come on. All right, let's go back for a moment to how he was respected as a human being, despite all of this, right? For everything that he did and for being a really fun personality. He was pretty accessible, right? Even, he spent a lot of time in Vegas. People would go to signings and all of that. I mean,
Yeah,
if
he
you
was
wanted to,
accessible,
he
often for a
was.
price.
Yes, for a price. But if you wanted to meet your hero, Pete Rose, you could. So you got to meet him. We've got a little photo to show you of you and Pete together here. So I know you're telling us how he was when you walked around with him, or you just around him on the set, or even with some of the other big names that you were working with. How respected was he? How excited were people to say hello to him?
Excited. Now, within our world at Fox Sports, our baseball group, he was kind of the crazy uncle, right? But he was a lot of fun. We all had a blast. And in fact, we had a group dinner in June, I believe, right before the Dodgers Yankees series in New York, where we all got together. We do this once in a blue moon, happens maybe once or twice a year. And we were telling Pete stories because there were some really good ones. Now, most of them I could not repeat here and would not want to repeat here. He was a colorful individual and he kept us entertained and he kept us laughing all the time. But fans do love him, and there's no question about that. When he walks into a ballpark, or, well, he wasn't walking into ballparks, he wasn't allowed to. But when he was around the set, people would acknowledge him and certainly know who the Hit King was. And he would not ever hesitate to remind them who the Hit King was. Very proud of that, as he should have been. As Eric said, 4,256 hits.
There's something else that he did that I'd be remiss if we didn't mention it. And I don't know if he's the last one to do it, but there has not been one in this generation for a long time. He was a player manager. Do you remember covering him as a player manager, thinking, because I know there was a couple others around that time, but do you remember your thought process as a young writer? Like, you're sitting there like, how's this going to work out? Like, are you putting yourself in and taking yourself out of games?
Actually, Eric, if I'm not mistaken, he was a player manager before I started as a baseball
Just
writer. I'm
before.
not positive. I'm not positive. What years? Do we have the years that he was a player
86,
manager?
86 was when 86 was when he was a player manager.
Okay, 87 was my first year covering baseball, and I
Ah,
covered the Orioles. So I never really had an
okay.
encounter with him in uniform. But it would have been interesting, certainly, asking him those kinds of questions. I covered a Hall of Fame manager a Hall of Fame player who became a manager, Frank Robinson. And certainly at times it could be intimidating. Frank was a different personality than Pete, of course. But it would have been a very unusual dynamic. Obviously, it's hardly ever occurred where a player is also the manager, and that would have been cool.
3 seasons, by the way. I'm doing some digging as you guys are chatting. 3 seasons. I mean, one was, for a small portion of the season, I guess he took over probably in 1984. He was 43 years old and he was a player manager. And then in 85 and 86, he was a player manager. 89 wins in 1985, 86 wins in 1986.
And
It
let's
was great
mention
to
also,
mention.
Scott,
Yeah.
while we're here, we know of him as a Cincinnati Red for the most part, but he was a huge part of the Phillies 1980 World Series championship team. And I remember that play. Can't remember the other player, but the bobble
Bob
in
Boone.
foul territory. Yep. When he came up with a foul pop-up, and man, Philly and him, that was a perfect match. And he did some great things there as well.
Highest paid athlete at the time when he signed with Philly.
Wow. And I'm sure he was very proud of that.
It was some basketball
He did
player
like
got more, and then Pete said, "I want to be the highest paid athlete in the world." I think. I mean, I'm from Philly, so I hear all these stories. My dad told me all these stories, and he said, "I'll never forget where I was when they signed Pete Rose." He was like, my dad was probably 26 at the time, so that was big for him.
This is cool, though. This is what you do, reminisce about a player that, the game has lost who was just a legend in our sport. So, Ken, thank you so much for sharing your stories and obviously your firsthand experiences with Pete as well and kind of defining some big parts of his career. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, guys.
FT Senior Insider Ken Rosenthal with us. Mondays and Thursdays, you can hear more from Ken. He's live with Alana Rizzo on Thursdays, 12:30 Eastern Time. If you want to join us right here on our YouTube channel, the FT YouTube channel, we cover big breaking news like this all the time. And again, thank you so much for checking out this video here and reminiscing with us a little bit on a guy who means a lot to many people who have been baseball fans for a long time. Pete Rose passes away at the age of 83.